So, what did I think of this book? Let me hit some big, broad points very quickly before I actually go into any specifics. I liked it. For me, it was a trip down memory lane in many cases. As I was reading some of this stuff, I realized, okay, yeah, that guy's name sounds familiar. Okay, yeah, the concept. All right, yeah, that over there, that's pretty well explained. What exactly am I talking about? Well, there are certain moments that Trump trolled the press that he mentions. He mentions Milo Yiannopoulos as well, talks about him some, and Coulter. And there's some moments brought up in the book that I remember. I remember it happening live. I would say that if you're my age, so I'm 27, I was 18 during the 20. Let's see, this would be when I was 17 first in 2015. Then I was 18 in 2016. So I voted November of 16 for Donald Trump. And I would say that if you were born in 1998 or before, you probably don't need to read this book. I still think it would help you. Like, for example, he mentions a couple of people in here. I didn't know about Nigel Farage very much. And then there's another guy. Oh my goodness, what's his name? I can find it. I want to say his last name's Good. And he was another interesting guy, a guy that I've never really read about in any sort of a nuanced way. I can find it here in a minute. But basically, there's a few people in here, really and truly, that I hadn't heard about before. And so I would say that you could probably benefit from it, whether you are my age or younger. But if you're younger than me, you're going to get a whole lot more out of this. We'll just put it that way. Why? Because if you're my age or older, you lived through this. For example, when he writes about Gavin McInnes, you probably remember a Gavin McInnes. Now, you may have been a lib and you didn't actually watch Get Off My Lawn when it was on CRTV, and then was acquired by the Blaze, and then changed hands again, and he ended up either being let go or fired, depending on what you want to believe. And he's an interesting guy. I'm not a big fan of him. To me, a lot of what he talks about is just kind of basic conservatism, and he tries to act like he's not. So, not a basic conservative, like he's something bigger. And the guy is very funny. Don't get me wrong. The guy is a comedian, definitely. I mean, he can make you laugh. But in terms of political commentary, there wasn't really a whole lot there. But Michael Malice talks about him. So, like I said, I really think that anyone one would get something out of this book. But for people that are more like my age and older, it's going to be a trip down memory lane. But you're still going to hear from some people that you weren't particularly familiar with. Like there's a man, an older guy. He's an older Southern gentleman, and let me try and find his name right quick because now, for the life of me, his name is leaving my brain. So this is, let me find the chapter number. Chapter 13. And there is a gentleman here that Michael Malice sat down with. Okay, yeah. Shoot. Jared Taylor. Yeah. And I've heard his name very rarely. But Michael Malice, a Jew, actually sat down with Jared Taylor and talked to him. And so you have this guy who's known as this big alt-right guy sitting down with Michael Malice, who's an anarchist who isn't particularly right wing or left wing. I don't know, because there's been times Michael Knowles has said to Michael Malice, "Oh, you're a right winger, right?" And Michael Malice is visibly uncomfortable. Goes, what makes you say that?" And you can tell he's not really comfortable being labeled right wing, but he may not necessarily be left wing either. I will tell you that as you read this book, this is kind of more just general thoughts on this book, that his social liberalism comes out. There's things he says about gays, there's things he says about any number of issues in this book. Immigration's another one where it comes very clear that this guy, Michael Malice, is actually very socially liberal. He is an anarchist. I have heard him say that he does not consider himself like a Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist. I wondered for a while if he was, because he's been on the Tom Woods show several times, and the two of them are very good friends. And also, Tom Woods has been on Michael Malice's program. I think it's been 4 times, something like that. And I love Tom Woods. Y'all know that I still really like him. In fact, whenever you see me go live, I have one of his books sitting next to me during my live streams. You can see it. It's called Real Descent. A libertarian sets fire to the index card of allowable opinion. I really wish that he would go back to being a paleo-conservative, though. That's what Tom Woods used to be. He was basic conservative, then paleo-conservative, and then moved over to libertarianism. And even so, I don't have really a problem with him personally. I would differ with his politics for sure, but I really like him. But Malice is different. Malice is definitely socially liberal. He still wants the state to be shrink to nothing. And I like Malice, though. I will say Malice is a very good interviewer. Whenever he has people on his show, you're welcome. He asks very good questions. In his commentary in the book, while I find flaws in it and strong disagreements with certain things he says, particularly about Pat Buchanan, is nevertheless interesting. It at least stimulates thought. And he is someone that's pretty hard-nosed. I mean, he's willing to hang out with Ann Coulter, who is in ways too far right for Fox News. I mean, she didn't used to be. She used to be a darling of pretty much all conservatives. But whenever she sided with Trump first, pretty much the only one at first, in 2016, became one of his biggest cheerleaders. And I don't mean that pejoratively. She was ostracized from a lot of people and then has gone on to say a number of things. Like she said she wouldn't vote for Vivek Ramaswamy because he's Indian. And by the way, I've talked about that at length. You can find if you go to Spotify or Amazon Music or Audible, and it should be on Substack too. I've talked about those comments that she made, and she actually covered it in a very cultural and nuanced way along religious lines that I thought was very interesting and insightful. And not in a way that was just like, oh, you're brown, I don't like you. No, she actually went into the history. And so she's a very intelligent person. And I also have a number of her books as well, sitting next to Pat Buchanan's books. I'm not a culture-right. I think she's way too hawkish on foreign policy, but I think that she's really good on immigration and some social issues. So anyway, he also, on that note, Michael Malice talks a good bit about her. And so you have Michael Malice sitting down with her, as I said, and with other people that are to the right of her by a long shot. And he's pretty comfortable with them. Michael Malice is not really a chameleon per se, but he's able to get along with people. He's hard-nosed enough where if someone hits him with some facts, he's able to either counter or at least stand in the face of it. He's not going to shrink back or back down. And I respect him on that. I disagree a lot with him, but I respect him. And this book is good because of the different people that he interviews. I think it benefits the reader. The reader can then read these people's opinions and say, okay, well, that was different. That was interesting. On the note about Buchanan, so this is pretty early on into the book. This was very interesting. I didn't know this, but back in, oh man, is this like chapter 3? Let me find it right quick. I believe it might actually be later into the book. There's a chapter where Michael actually mentions an opinion by Rush Limbaugh that I thought was kind of interesting, because Rush Limbaugh said something about Pat Buchanan. You know, Rush Limbaugh was someone that I really liked growing up because he was funny and owned the libs, and I thought would stand up to him, stuff like that. Truth be told, he didn't exactly really present a better opinion than you would get on like Fox News. And looking at him now, I think you can have nuance and say, look, he was anti-left, and that's great, that's funny, but he wasn't particularly hardcore right-wing, definitely not on foreign policy. On other issues, was he not? Did he do more harm than good? That's kind of a hard one. I would argue he probably did more good than harm, but by it's a close one. It's like 51-49 or something, because no one was beating the word drum harder than Rush Limbaugh. Then maybe, the only other person might be like Sean Hannity or Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. But this was interesting. So one thing that Michael Malice does in this book, and this is still in, I just had it, I think it said chapter 4. I'm sorry, I was strong. It's chapter 3. He looks a lot at the Paleo Alliance throughout this entire book. Michael Malice comments on the Paleo Alliance between the Paleo Conservatives and the Paleo Libertarians. And it was interesting because the Paleo Conservatives disagree with the Libertarians on economics, but on a lot of cultural issues they agreed. And even some of the Paleo Cons, while being right-wing, didn't want the government to necessarily enforce morality. So they were friends with Paleo Libertarians on that stance. And they were also both anti-war. But as time went on, this sort of frazzled, and eventually the alliance wore out and went away and ended up breaking up in some sense. So this was interesting. There's something that I wanted to read here. This is on page 53, but again, chapter 3. Rothbard, this is again in the Paleo Alliance, found himself courting the same types of people who had venerated Strom Thurmond in 1948. I'm going to stop right here and say, you guys really need to read that book, Annals of the Stupid Party by Clyde N. Wilson, because he talks about Strom Thurmond in, I think, is a very balanced way. Lindsey Graham actually stepped into Strom Thurmond's shoes when he became senator of South Carolina, and that was a significant downgrade. Thurmond was by no means perfect. He liked to chase tail, but he was way better than Lindsey Graham, even though he had been a Democrat before. So anyway, back to the book, Strom Thurmond in 1948. His old buddy, Ron Paul, seemed to agree with this approach. Ron Paul's political report featured several eyebrow-raising turns of phrase, such as the claim that order was only restored in L.A. after the 1992 riots when it came time for the blacks to pick up their welfare checks 3 days after rioting began, end quote. Rothbard also saw fit to, if not exactly champion, ex-Klansman David Duke, at least denounce his critics. That a former KKK official's sincerity would be in doubt seemed shocking to Rothbard. It took a campaign of slander that resorted to questioning the sincerity of Duke's conversion to Christianity, end quote. One wonders how Rothbard would have grappled with the repentant Mr. Duke's 2003 book, Jewish Supremacism, My Awakening to the Jewish Question, which included the claim that Jews literally shapeshifted to fit in among the Christians. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, both Rothbard and Buchanan decided. So it was Rothbard came on board the 1992 Buchanan presidential campaign. Buchanan remained a pro-labor religious protectionist. Pat Buchanan is not a conservative, Rush Limbaugh would later insist. He's a populist, end quote. Rothbard was still an anarchist opposed to the government always and in all ways. Both were far more united in what they were against, namely progressivism in all its form, than in what they were for. But both also shared a complete contempt for the political establishment left and right. Both presaged the new right in its entirety, end quote. So I want to put that down for a second and just say, this is interesting because here you have Rush Limbaugh, who is sort of conservative, sort of not. And to him, I should say, Pat Buchanan is not a conservative. He's a populist. Now, all things being equal, do I consider Pat Buchanan to be a populist? Sort of. I mean, he's a right-wing populist if he's to be considered a populist at all. I would consider him more of a paleo conservative. And I don't think that that's unreasonable or unfair. I think that it's perfectly fine to look at his moral stances and his stances on trade and say, okay, did he have a stance on trade that a lot of populists would agree with? Sure. But that's an old school conservative stance. Old conservatives were hawkish on trade. They wanted fair trade, not free trade. It was as time went on with the Bushes in particular, but even probably it had its beginnings with Reagan. You could probably make the argument maybe Ford that started to change, that it became all about, oh, free trade, deregulate everything. It was before that. I mean, when you look at, okay, this was the party of Teddy Roosevelt. We were the party of Teddy Roosevelt that was hawkish on the economy, on making sure everyone had a square deal. I mean, that was what Teddy Roosevelt famously ran on when he ran independent. He ran with the Bull Moose movement, the Progressive Party, I think was what he called it at first. Which, okay, yeah, did that end up getting co-opted by leftists, and has that term been hijacked by leftists? This is something I've kind of talked about at times when I've talked about the neo-reactionary trichotomy. The people that stand up for the working man, the real people that do that, are the so-called right-wing populists and the nationalists. They're the ones that actually do. These commie types will act like they do, but they don't. They actually support the government getting so much power and so much wealth that they end up screwing the little guy even more, right? And again, I don't really identify as a populist. I agree with some of their policies when it makes sense. And I can expound on that in the future. But that's the thing. The term progressive originated in the Republican Party. Do you have any idea if Teddy Roosevelt, where does this come from? That Teddy Roosevelt would support trans rights or gay marriage? Heck no. And he was hawkish against Russia, and there were certain wars that he got involved with. The man loved militarism and war, sure. I'm willing to accept that. So in ways, he was a little bit neocon on that. But the man was very much a populist and a real progressive and in a good way. That term has been co-opted by leftists who really are trying to talk a good game about being populist and then force feed everyone trans rights and liberal values. And the problem too is whenever these people get in power, they inevitably get corrupted very quickly. And to be fair, there's plenty of people on the right that get corrupted very quickly as well. But a prime example of this is AOC. She had all this promise of going in looking like a left-wing populist, and even her own voters are mad at her because she's taking the big PAC money. And of course, there's people on the right that take big PAC money. That's not the point. One thing I think that's important to look at here is something in this chapter. It mentions Ross Perot, so I want to talk at some point, probably either in a video from my YouTube channel or Rumble channel about Ross Perot, my thoughts on Perot. But anyway, one thing that I did not like is that apparently Hoppe, Michael Malice quotes Hoppe here, referred to Buchanan as either a social nationalist or a national socialist, which is such a dumb liberal thing to do. Like, why would you do that? Why in the world would you treat a good man like Pat Buchanan that badly? It's preposterous that you would refer to Pat Buchanan as a national socialist. And speaking of people that are disgusting, there are also quotes here from William F. Buckley. Let's look at Buckley for a second.